The first time David Chen noticed the family on his other side of the fence, he didn't think much of it. It was a Saturday in June, 3 years ago, the kind of day where the sun hammered down like judgment and the neighborhood sprawled quiet and sleepy. He was floating on his favorite raft, the one his ex-wife had given him as a joke, shaped like a flamingo, when he heard the metallic creak of the gate. He thought it was his gate. It wasn't. The Hendersons had somehow discovered that the weathered wooden fence between their properties had a gap near the hinges. Not much of a gap, maybe 6 inches at best, but enough for a child to wriggle through, and apparently enough for the Henderson children to discover a portal to water heaven. David watched from the raft as a girl, maybe 9, splashed into the deep end. Then a boy, younger, cannonballed in with the kind of abandon that suggested he'd done this before. Mrs. Henderson, Karen, as he would come to think of her with increasing bitterness, stood at the edge of the pool, drink in hand, her designer sunglasses reflecting the water like empty promises. "Kids, deeper end," she called out, as if his pool were merely an extension of her living room. David's first instinct was to say something. He'd always been the type. Growing up in San Francisco, raised by parents who believed in speaking your truth and addressing conflict directly, he'd never learned the art of quiet suffering. He sat up on the flamingo raft, disturbing the water, and opened his mouth. Then something stopped him. Pity, maybe? Or just the particular exhaustion of being a 42-year-old divorced man who'd recently moved to the suburbs specifically to escape the kind of human friction that had characterized his marriage. His therapist, Dr. Morrison, a woman with the patience of Job, had suggested he might benefit from letting small things go and practicing the serenity to accept what he cannot change. So David did something almost unnatural to his personality. He lay back down on the flamingo raft and said nothing. The children stayed for 2 hours. When they finally left, Karen didn't offer a wave or an apology or even acknowledgement. She simply herded the kids back through the gap in the fence like a mother duck, and the silence that followed felt like a held breath. David's sister, Michelle, was the first to hear about it. She called him that evening, as she did every Saturday, a ritual born from their childhood and maintained through stubbornness and genuine affection. "You let them do what?" Her voice climbed to a register he'd only heard her use during their mother's funeral, and the time she found out their father had a second family in Phoenix. "Michelle, you have a pool, David. A beautiful, expensive pool that you paid for, and you let some random family just swim in it like it's a public facility. Did you at least ask their names?" "Karen and Mike Henderson. Their kids are Riley and Aiden. They moved in last month. I think Mike is some kind of software engineer at." "I don't care if he's the CEO of Google. You have property rights." David winced. He could hear his ex-wife's voice in Michelle's certainty. Divorce had taught him that the world was divided into people who believed in absolute boundaries and people who believed in absolute chaos, and most of the time, those two types married each other and slowly dissolved. "It's not that big a deal," he said, not believing it even as he spoke. "Not yet," Michelle replied darkly. She was right, of course. She usually was. But David had learned over the course of a 42-year life that sometimes you could know someone was right and still choose to do nothing, because doing something required an energy he simply didn't have. The Henderson family returned the following weekend. And the weekend after that. By the 4th weekend, David had stopped pretending to read his books when they arrived. By the 8th, he'd stopped wearing sunscreen on days he knew they'd come, letting the sun burn his shoulders in a kind of self-inflicted penance. It wasn't just the children anymore. Karen had apparently decided that the gap in the fence was an open invitation. She brought friends. She brought her mother. One particularly ambitious Saturday, she arrived with a catering truck and what appeared to be the entire book club she belonged to. "Can you believe we found this spot?" he heard her tell one of her friends, a woman with aggressively blonde hair and the kind of posture that suggested years of Pilates. "The previous owners barely used it. Their loss, our gain." David realized in that moment that she believed it. Karen genuinely believed that the pool was communal property, a gift from the universe specifically for her enjoyment. The possibility that she'd never actually asked permission or considered that he might not want her there didn't register. In her world, things existed to be used, and if you were bold enough, if you were willing to squeeze through a gap and take what you wanted, then, morally speaking, it was yours. He understood suddenly why people committed crimes of passion. You need to fix that fence, he told himself, but he didn't. He repaired it abstractly in his mind while doing nothing in reality. There was something almost masochistic about his inaction, a way of maintaining some connection to the universe's vast indifference to his suffering. He was swimming in a public pool that happened to be in his backyard. Fine. That was fine. Everything was fine. By September, the Hendersons had invited their extended family for what appeared to be a pool birthday party. David counted 43 people. 43. He'd actually counted, standing in his bedroom window like a voyeur, his fingers moving against the glass as if he could physically number them. His neighbor on the other side, an older gentleman named Roger, finally said something to him as they were both getting their mail. "Your fence is destroyed," Roger observed, not unkindly. "Yes, I know. You going to fix it?" "Maybe. The Henderson woman told my wife that you were so generous, sharing your pool." Roger's voice carried a particular kind of disgust, the disgust of someone who'd spent 60 years watching people take things that didn't belong to them and learning that politeness was a weapon. David felt something crack inside him then. Not break, he'd learned the difference. A break was sudden and catastrophic. A crack was the beginning of a structural failure, the hairline fracture that would eventually compromise the integrity of the entire foundation. He didn't respond to Roger. He walked back inside, locked the door, and called his contractor. "I need to build something," he told Marcus Webb when the man called him back. Marcus was a short, broad-shouldered man with tattoos of measuring tapes running up both his forearms and a habit of saying exactly what he thought. David had used him before for the deck renovation, and Marcus had the particular gift of understanding what someone needed before they knew themselves. "What kind of something?" Marcus asked. "A wall around my pool." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. David imagined Marcus processing this, running calculations, determining whether his client had finally lost his mind. "Let me come look," Marcus said finally. "Then we can talk." When Marcus arrived at the house 2 days later, he walked straight to the fence, studied the gap, and then walked around the entire pool area, his eyes narrowing with professional assessment. "You want to enclose the entire perimeter," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Completely. I want them to hear the water. I want them to know they can't access it. I want it to be impossible to access it. 8-foot privacy wall, concrete." "Whatever it takes." Marcus pulled out his phone and took some measurements. He stood in the middle of the pool area and looked up at the sky like a man making a calculation in his bones. "This is going to cost you," he said. "How much?" "25,000, maybe 30 with permits and labor. You sure about this?" David looked at the gap in the fence. He looked at the pool, his pool, the one thing he'd always wanted, the dream he'd bought before everything fell apart with Sarah. He thought about the future, a whole summer of peace, of his own space returned to him intact. "Build it," he said. Marcus smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who'd seen a lot of human nature and found it endlessly fascinating. "This is going to piss her off something fierce," he said. "That's the idea. You thought about what comes next." David hadn't, but in that moment he decided he didn't care. The crack had become a fault line. The fault line was about to become an earthquake. The work started on the first Monday of October. The sound of the power drill woke Corinne Henderson at 6:47 a.m. She came to the window of her master bedroom in her expensive silk pajamas, the ones Mike had bought her for her birthday, the ones she'd made a point of mentioning to her mother-in-law because she knew it would irritate her, and stared out at what was happening in the Chen property. A man in a hard hat was marking out the ground with spray paint. Another man, older and tattooed, was operating a drill, creating pilot holes for fence posts. She blinked, thinking maybe she was still dreaming. She'd had disturbing dreams lately, nothing she'd mentioned to her therapist or Mike, but disturbing nonetheless. Dreams about drowning, dreams about water that was too hot or too cold or too something. Corinne had never been the kind of woman who questioned her own desires or impulses. She'd been raised by a mother who believed that confidence was the solution to every problem and that most people were operating at approximately 60% of their full power because they were too worried about what others thought. "Never apologize for taking what you want," her mother had told her. "The world doesn't respect apologetic people." So Karen had been bold. She'd been unapologetic. She'd seen the gap in the fence 3 months ago, a gap that had clearly existed for years, untended and obviously unimportant to the quiet, solitary man who lived on the other side. She'd made a simple calculation. Here was a pool, unused by anyone meaningful. She'd watched the man float aimlessly on a ridiculous flamingo raft all summer, and here was an opportunity. She'd taken it. Now, standing at the window in her $600 pajamas, she watched as the man with the tattoos, who she would later learn was named Marcus Webb, and who had a reputation for not suffering fools, laid out massive concrete panels. She went downstairs and stood in her backyard, coffee in hand, and called across the fence to David, who was standing there in a hoodie despite the warm October weather, arms crossed, looking like some kind of vengeful ghost. "David, hey, David." He turned to her. His face was blank in a way that suggested tremendous effort to keep it that way. "What are you doing?" she asked, not genuinely curious, but performatively so, as if she already knew the answer and was giving him an opportunity to explain it in a way that made sense. "Building a pool enclosure," he said. "A pool enclosure, you mean a wall?" "An 8-foot privacy wall," Marcus supplied, straightening up with his hands on his hips in a way that suggested he found this conversation mildly entertaining. "Concrete, full perimeter. It's going to be beautiful when we're done, totally secure." Karen felt something in her chest that she would later, in therapy, identify as the first real feeling she'd had in months. Not joy or anger exactly, but clarity. The kind of clarity that came when you realized someone had fundamentally misunderstood you. "Is this because of us?" she asked David. "Yes," he said, "just that, just the word. You're spending tens of thousands of dollars because my family used your pool a few times." $30,000, Marcus corrected, almost conversationally. "And it wasn't a few times, ma'am. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen a pool used that regularly by people who didn't live in the house." David shot Marcus a look that suggested he appreciated the support. "That's petty," Karen said. She said it with the confidence of someone used to defining the terms of every interaction. "That's actually petty, and frankly, it's kind of sad. A man your age spending that kind of money just because some kids wanted to cool off. It's like View County. It gets to 95 degrees. We were being reasonable." "In my backyard," David said quietly. "Without permission," Marcus added, because apparently he decided to become invested in this drama. "Every time, no permission." "It's not like we were stealing anything," Karen protested. "The water was just sitting there." "It was sitting there in my property," David said. "The water didn't ask to be used any more than it asked to be there. But I paid for it. I paid for the maintenance. I paid for the chemicals. I paid for the infrastructure. And I did all of that under the assumption that I could use my own property without it being treated as a public resource." Karen wanted to argue. She could feel the argument building in her chest like a pressure system, but there was something in David's face that stopped her. Not sadness exactly, not anger either, something colder, something that had already made its decision and wasn't interested in further input. "The wall goes up Monday through Friday," Marcus said, not looking at either of them. "We'll have it done by next weekend. It's going to be beautiful, really transformative for the space." Karen went back inside without responding. She sat at her kitchen island and texted Mike. "Your neighbor is building a wall around his pool because of the kids swimming." Mike, who was in a meeting in Denver and had never actually met David Chen, though he'd heard about him in the way you hear about neighbors, a general awareness of existence, nothing more, responded. "Sounds reasonable." Which made Karen feel, inexplicably, more angry than David's certainty had. She called her best friend Stephanie, who was head of the book club and who had particular opinions about everything. Stephanie had apparently also seen the construction and had already formed opinions. "He's trying to make you feel small," Stephanie said immediately. "That's what that wall is. It's a fuck you in concrete form." "Should I do something?" Karen asked. "Like what?" "I don't know. Talk to him. Apologize." "Apologize for what? Letting your kids cool off?" Stephanie made a sound like a snort. "Karen, that's weak. You don't negotiate with people like that. You either match their energy or you let it roll off you. What you don't do is apologize and let him define you as the bad guy." Karen held onto those words like they were something valuable. What you don't do is apologize and let him define you as the bad guy. She watched the wall go up over the next 5 days. Monday, the posts went in, 6-foot-deep holes drilled into the earth with an auger that made her kitchen vibrate slightly. The man with the tattoos worked with brutal efficiency, stopping only for lunch at exactly noon, then resuming exactly at 12:30. Tuesday, the framework was built, massive wooden beams that would support the weight of the concrete. It began to look like something from a prison construction manual or like a fortification. Wednesday, they poured the concrete. A truck arrived at 7 in the morning, and the sound of it mixing, the smell of it, chemical and oppressive, filled the neighborhood. David's backyard began to look like an archaeological dig, sections being filled in, a barrier rising inch by inch. Thursday, they poured more. The wall was 7 feet high by the end of the day, and it was beginning to cast a shadow over her property around 3 p.m. Friday, the final pour, the capstone, the moment when the enclosure became complete and irreversible. By Saturday morning, there was a wall between the Henderson property and the Chen property. Not a decorative wall, not an aesthetic choice. A wall that said, in every concrete molecule, "You are not welcome here." Karen stood in her backyard and stared at it. It was tan-colored, slightly imperfect in the way that handmade things are, with small shadows cast by the texture of the forms they'd used. She could no longer hear the sound of David's pool filter. She could no longer hear the water. She could no longer see the pool at all. Mike came home that afternoon, saw the wall, and whistled low. "He built that because of us?" Mike asked, not angry, just honestly curious in the way he was curious about most things. He was an engineer, accustomed to problems and solutions, but also accustomed to understanding that a wall this expensive was a solution to something that ran deeper than practical property disputes. "Because I let the kids swim," Karen said. "In his pool." Multiple times, the fence had a gap. Mike walked up to the wall and ran his hand over it, assessing. "This is well built," he said. "Good materials. This guy paid professional money for this. He's a tech guy." "I don't actually know what he does." "He's making a statement," Mike said. "That's what this is. This is a man making a statement about boundaries." "It's passive-aggressive." "It's direct as hell," Mike disagreed. "A wall isn't passive-aggressive, it's active-aggressive. He's literally not letting you ignore him anymore." Karen turned away from the wall and went back inside. She didn't like the way the wall made her feel. She didn't like the clarity of it. She'd gotten very good over the course of her 47 years at not acknowledging the feelings of people who made her uncomfortable. It was one of her primary skills, but the wall didn't allow for that. The wall demanded acknowledgement. The following Monday, Karen received something in her mailbox. Not a letter. An envelope containing a single sheet of paper printed on what appeared to be expensive stock. It was an invoice. The invoice was itemized with surgical precision. Invoice 2, Henderson Residence, 447 Maple Drive, Lakeview County, CA. RE, pool usage fees and enclosure cost allocation. Professional pool maintenance, estimated average use by non-residents, $4,200. Chemicals and filtration system usage, $1,850. Estimated water costs, 65 uses, 500 gallons per use, $1,300. Wear and tear on pool deck, $800. Stress-related therapy sessions required due to unauthorized use of personal property, 18 sessions, $180, $3,240. Structural wall construction to prevent further unauthorized use, $28,500. Legal consultation fees, 3 hours at $400 hour, $1,200. Total, $41,090. Payment TRMS, 30 days from receipt. Note, this invoice reflects 3 years of unauthorized use and constitutes a reasonable estimate of damages and preventative costs incurred by David Chen to reclaim his property rights. Karen read it 3 times, then read it again. She felt Mike read it over her shoulder. "Is he serious?" she asked. "Very," Mike said quietly. "This is either the most brilliant or most insane thing I've ever seen." "It's harassment. This is harassment." "Is it?" Mike asked, not argumentatively, but genuinely. "He's itemizing what you used. He's being specific. This reads like someone who thought about this very carefully and decided to quantify exactly how much you'd benefited from his property. The therapy sessions are insane, Karen protested. That's absurd, that's clearly unreasonable. Is it? Mike asked again, and there was something in his voice now that suggested he was leaving her to sit with the question alone. You did use his pool repeatedly without permission. You did, by his calculation, cost him money and cause him stress. Whether he actually went to therapy, I don't know, but the logic chain is sound. I'm not paying this is extortion. Mike set the invoice down on the counter. You should probably call a lawyer before you decide that. Karen called Stephanie instead. He's trying to intimidate you, Stephanie said immediately. This is textbook intimidation. You should call the cops. This is a threat. Is an invoice a threat? When it's clearly designed to scare you? Yes, it's harassment. You should call the police. Karen called the police non-emergency line. She explained what had happened. She read parts of the invoice. The officer who responded, a woman named Tors with the patient tone of someone who'd heard 1,000 variations of this exact story, listened to the entire account and then asked, in a neutral voice, did you have permission to use his pool? Well, no, but... And he's now requesting payment for the cost of the material you used. And therapy sessions? He's claiming therapy sessions. Officer Tors made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh but suggested the territories around one. That's creative, she said. The water and maintenance costs he might have an argument for. The therapy sessions are going to be harder to justify in court. But technically, if he can document that he actually went to therapy and that the sessions were related to stress caused by unauthorized use of his property, a judge might allow them as a component of damages. So he can sue me. I think if you don't pay it, he probably will, yes. After she hung up, Karen sat in her kitchen and tried to feel angry. She tried to build up the righteous indignation that Stephanie kept fueling on their ongoing calls. But under the anger was something else, something that felt more like recognition. She had used his pool multiple times without permission, while knowing, at some level, some deep acknowledgement she'd been trying not to look at, that she shouldn't. She called David. Hi, she said when he answered. His voice was neutral. I got your invoice. Yes. Is this serious? Completely serious. I can't pay $40,000. Then I'll see you in small claims court, he said. Or I'll see a settlement, whichever you prefer. Can we talk about this? I don't think there's anything left to discuss. You used my property without permission. I've itemized the costs. Now it's on you to decide how you want to handle it. Karen wanted to explain. She wanted to make him understand that she hadn't meant any harm, that it was just the gap in the fence, that the kids had just wanted to cool off, that she'd been trying to make friends in the neighborhood, that her life was harder than it looked from the outside, that the pool had been a small, bright thing in a summer that had been more difficult than she'd wanted anyone to know about. But she'd been a woman for 47 years, long enough to understand that men like David Chen, men who made their grievances into concrete, weren't interested in context or explanation or the softening details of human complexity. They wanted clarity. They wanted their wrongs to be acknowledged as wrongs, completely and without qualification. What if I could work something out? She tried. Work what out? A payment plan, a reduced amount, something. The invoice is final, he said, 30 days from receipt. He hung up. Karen sat in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and realized she had, for the first time in her life, come up against someone who simply did not care whether she felt understood. She called her lawyer. Her lawyer, a woman named Patricia who charged $350 per hour and who'd handled her divorce from a previous marriage, a detail she'd never mentioned to Mike, listened to the entire story and then said, "You're fucked." Excuse me. You're fucked, Patricia repeated, not unkindly. He has documentation of unauthorized use. You admit to it. He's calculated damages. Even if the therapy sessions don't hold up in court, the maintenance costs, the water costs, the wear and tear, a judge will probably award him something. You're not obligated to pay the full amount, but you're also not in a position to negotiate from strength. The best case scenario is you settle for maybe half. $15,000, $20,000. That's insane. Yes, Patricia agreed, but it's legal insanity. There's a difference. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen found herself making a strange calculation. She could pay him. Money wasn't actually the issue. Mike made good money. She'd inherited money from her father. They had savings. But paying him meant acknowledging in concrete financial terms that she had done something wrong. It meant becoming small. It meant Stephanie being wrong and Corinne's mother being wrong and the entire philosophy of never apologizing that had guided her through life being, finally and irreversibly, wrong. She asked Mike what he thought she should do. "Pay him," Mike said. "It's not even a question. You took something that wasn't yours. He's asking you to compensate him. Pay him." "Even the therapy sessions?" "Negotiate those, but the rest of it, yeah, pay it." "Don't you think this is absurd?" "I think this is what happens when someone finally decides to set a boundary and then commits to maintaining it," Mike said, and there was something in his voice that made Corinne understand, suddenly, that Mike had probably wanted to set a boundary with her for quite some time. That the wall around the pool had somehow given him permission to think about his own boundaries, the ones he'd been holding back on for years. That realization was somehow worse than the invoice. She drafted a check for $32,000, less than the full amount, with the therapy sessions as the negotiating point, and wrote a letter to accompany it. "Dear David, I've enclosed a check for $32,000. I'm not disputing the maintenance costs, water costs, or structural damage. Those are all legitimate expenses I caused. I'm adjusting the therapy sessions because I believe that's an unreasonable expense to bill a neighbor for, but I'm willing to discuss that separately. I apologize for using your pool without permission. It was wrong. I knew at the time it was wrong, and I did it anyway. I'm sorry. Sincerely, Corinne Henderson." She left the check and letter in his mailbox on a Friday afternoon after Mike left for work and before the kids got home from school. She did it quickly, without allowing herself time to reconsider. She waited for his response. It took 3 days. The check had been cashed. There was no letter, no acknowledgement, just a confirmation from her bank that the money had been withdrawn. Corinne realized in that moment that there was something almost worse than conflict. There was indifference. The wall remained. Part 4, the fallout. The neighborhood noticed everything. By the time the second week of November arrived, the wall had become the topic of conversation at every gathering, every coffee, every book club meeting. The story had been retold and embellished. In some versions, David Chen was a bitter divorcee who'd gone psychologically unstable. In others, Corinne Henderson was a wealthy woman who'd victimized a working-class man and then used her privilege to escape consequences. Somewhere between those extremes was a kernel of truth that nobody seemed particularly interested in. The wall itself had become a kind of landmark. People took photos of it. They made jokes. Someone even spray-painted a mural on the outside, not malicious, but a simple line drawing of a phoenix rising from flames, which seemed to miss the point so thoroughly that Corinne thought it might be the most honest commentary on the situation. David had stopped coming to neighborhood events. The fall festival, traditionally hosted on the green space at the center of their development, was held without him. Corinne watched for him, not with hope or even particular anticipation, but with the awareness of a missing piece. His absence was more present than his presence would have been. The kids had taken it differently. Riley, her 9-year-old, asked repeatedly if they could still go to the pool. When Corinne explained that they couldn't, that it wasn't their pool and never had been, Riley had gone quiet in a way that suggested a fundamental shift in how she understood the world. Aiden, her 6-year-old, had started drawing pictures of walls. Just walls. Thick lines in black crayon, no perspective, no detail, just the idea of walls in every picture. Mike had become quieter, more distant. He went to work earlier and came home later. He stopped making jokes. When Corinne tried to talk about what was happening, he deflected with a kind of patience that felt like distance. One evening in mid-November, Corinne was alone in the kitchen when her mother called. "I heard you had some situation with a neighbor," her mother said, in the tone she used when she already knew everything and was simply giving Corinne an opportunity to explain the version she wanted known. "It's handled," Corinne said. "Is it? Because Linda Fisher called me. You remember Linda from the club. And she said something about a wall and an invoice. Is it true he's suing you?" "He's not suing me. I paid what he asked for." "That's embarrassing," her mother said, not with judgment but with what sounded like genuine concern for Corinne's social standing. "I thought I taught you better than that. I thought I taught you that you don't let people push you around." He didn't push me around, Karen said, hearing how defensive she sounded. He set a boundary. A boundary is a line. What he did was a punishment. Karen wanted to argue, but she was tired. She was tired of defending herself. She was tired of trying to make people understand her perspective when the reality was that she'd been wrong, and the punishment, the wall, the invoice, the indifference, felt proportional to the violation. He's right, Karen heard herself say. I used his pool without permission. Multiple times, I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It carried something Karen hadn't heard before. Are you okay? She asked. I don't know, Karen said. I don't think so. After they hung up, Karen stood in her kitchen and looked out at the wall. She'd begun to see it differently. At first, it had been an attack, a betrayal, a demonstration of superiority. Now it was beginning to look like something else, a clear statement of what belonged to whom and what didn't. She went to the fence where the wall had been built and she placed her hand against it. It was warm despite the November cold, textured, real. Some unknown person, nobody ever figured out who, had posted a photograph of the wall along with the story, more or less accurately, though with the tone of someone who found the entire situation darkly hilarious. The post went viral in the neighborhood Facebook group, then in adjacent neighborhood groups, then in county Facebook groups. It had over 20,000 shares within a week. The comments divided neatly along predictable lines. People who thought David was heroic, a man standing up for property rights in an increasingly lawless society. People who thought he was a bully, a man who could have simply fixed the fence or set a boundary verbally but instead chose to punish. People who found it funny. People who found it sad. People who projected their own experience of boundaries onto the situation and found either vindication or trauma. The coverage expanded. A local news station picked it up. Lakeview County man builds $30,000 wall to keep neighbors out of pool, the headline read, with the kind of tone that suggested bemused confusion about why anyone would care about this story. David was interviewed. He sat with the reporter, a young woman named Cynthia Chen, no relation, and explained with patient clarity exactly what had happened. I didn't want conflict, he said. I just wanted my property respected. When polite coexistence wasn't possible, I had to make it impossible for the violation to continue. That was structural honesty. But $30,000, Cynthia said, trying to lead him into some admission of excess, some crack in his reasonableness. Is less than she would have cost in therapy, he replied, and something in his tone suggested he'd thought about this a great deal. The violation of boundary creates trauma. I charged her for the material and the labor and the emotional cost of defending my own space. That's fair. Karen wasn't interviewed, but people came to her door. Reporters at first, then just interested parties, neighborhood people who wanted to hear the real story from her perspective. She stopped answering the door. The book club met without her for the first time in 5 years. Stephanie reported back that they'd discussed the situation, and opinion was divided, though the general consensus seemed to be that Karen had overreacted by paying him, that she'd set a precedent that boundaries could be purchased. You let him win, Stephanie said over wine that Karen hadn't even offered to pour. You paid him and he won. What would winning look like? Karen asked. Not paying him, negotiating harder, actually fighting back. Fighting back with what? He was right, I was wrong. I used his pool without permission. He's allowed to want that to stop. But your acting like this is some profound moral reckoning, Stephanie said, and there was irritation in her voice, as if Karen's acceptance of responsibility was somehow a criticism of everyone else's lack of it. You're acting like you've learned something. Haven't I? I don't think so. I think you've just decided to let him define you as the person who was wrong, and you're going to spend the next 5 years being that person in this neighborhood. Karen considered this. It was probably true. Social media had a long memory. The wall had become a story, and she had become the villain of the story. In 6 months or a year, she might be less present in people's thoughts, but the narrative wouldn't change. She'd always be the woman who trespassed on her neighbor's pool, who got caught, who had to pay. The wall woman. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to Mike, who was himself awake but pretending to sleep, the way people do when they're avoiding the kind of conversation that requires true vulnerability. Are you angry with me? She asked into the darkness. No, Mike said, which meant yes. About the pool situation. About a lot of things, he said, and his voice was gentler than she expected. But not angry, just aware. Aware that we've been living a life where certain things didn't have consequences because I was willing to absorb those consequences. And then suddenly there was someone who wasn't willing, and I realized I should have been that person a long time ago. Are you saying I should have paid attention to your boundaries? I'm saying I should have maintained them, he said. The pool was just the moment I realized I hadn't been. They lay in silence for a long time. By January, the wall had become a permanent part of the neighborhood's infrastructure. People had stopped noticing it. It was simply there, a tan-colored barrier that separated two properties and two very different philosophies about what you were owed just by existing in proximity to others. David had stopped going to the community events, not out of malice, but out of a kind of logical consistency. He'd established boundaries. It made sense not to violate them by pretending to be a part of a community he'd had to defend his property from. His sister Michelle visited at the end of the month, and she stood in his backyard looking at the wall and said, "Are you happy?" "Yes," David said, though the question seemed to require more thought than he'd expected. "Really? I have my pool back," he said. "No one's violating it. No one's treating my property like it's communal. I fixed the problem." "Did you?" Michelle asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you created a wall between you and a community that's going to remain a wall forever. You didn't just solve a problem. You created evidence of it. Every day, that wall is there, reminding everyone that you couldn't solve this with conversation." "I tried conversation," David said. "Or I tried inaction, which is conversation's cousin." "Did you really? Or did you just hope they'd respect your implied boundaries?" David didn't answer, but he felt the truth of it. He'd never actually talked to Karen. He'd never sat her down and said, "Your use of my pool without permission is unacceptable. Here's why, and here's what the consequences will be if it continues." He'd just built a wall instead. "What did you expect would happen?" Michelle asked. "I expected them to stop coming." "And they did, but now they hate you. Your entire neighborhood thinks you're unhinged. Your property value has probably gone down because of this. You've become the cautionary tale. Is that victory?" David looked at the wall. He'd been so focused on the boundary he'd created that he hadn't paid attention to what the creation of that boundary had created in return. A story, a narrative, a neighborhood divided by concrete. "I'm thinking about taking it down," he said. Michelle looked at him sharply. "Really?" "I'm not sure. I'm thinking about it." Karen found out about this through Stephanie, who'd heard it from Roger, who'd heard it from someone at the gym who'd overheard Marcus Webb mentioning that David had called him about removal possibilities. She was paralyzed by the information in a way she wouldn't have expected. If the wall came down, what did that mean? Did it mean forgiveness? Did it mean the payment was a waste? Did it mean she needed to apologize again? She went to David's house on a Saturday morning in early February. The wall was still there, intact and monolithic, but she knocked on his door anyway. He answered, looking surprised in a way that suggested he'd successfully trained himself not to expect her. "Hi," she said. "Hi. I heard you might be taking the wall down." "I'm considering it," he said carefully. "Why would you do that?" He looked confused by the question. "Because I've been thinking about whether I was right, and I'm not sure I was. I was right that my boundary was violated. I was right to be angry. I was right that you didn't have permission. But I'm not sure I was right to turn that violation into a permanent structure." Karen felt something catch in her throat. "I deserved it, though." "Did you?" David asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. "You made a mistake. You used my pool. I punished you for it. Now we're both unhappy. Is there anything in that sequence that feels just?" "No," Karen said quietly. "I built that wall to solve a problem," David continued. "But all I really did was turn a temporary violation into a permanent wound. Your family can't use my pool, but I also can't be a part of this community anymore. The wall solved one problem by creating another." "So you're just going to take it down, after all of this?" "I don't know," David said. "I'm genuinely uncertain. Taking it down feels like saying that your violation didn't matter, and it did. Keeping it up feels like I'm committing myself to permanent separation. Neither option feels right." Karen left his house feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, exactly, not resolution, but something else. Uncertainty, maybe. Recognition that both of them had been trying to navigate something without guidelines, something that didn't come with clear solutions. A week later, Karen made a decision. She went to the wall with her family, Mike and Riley and Aiden, and she showed them what she wanted to do. "I want to put something on the other side of the wall," she said. "Something that's not angry, something that's just, here, evidence that we acknowledge what happened." With Mike's help, she constructed a small garden on their side of the wall, nothing elaborate, just some shrubs and flowers planted in a small bed that ran along the entire length. On a small plaque, she had engraved, "We were wrong here. We're trying to be better." She didn't ask David's permission. She didn't need to. The garden was on her property. But she planted it carefully, as if the wall was watching, as if somehow her actions on her side of the structure might speak across concrete to the man on the other side. By spring, something unexpected happened. The flowers bloomed. David noticed them first, actually, when he was standing in his yard one afternoon in April, looking out at the wall that had become his constant companion. He could see the pink and purple of the blooms over the top of the 8-foot barrier. He didn't mention it to anyone, but he started paying attention. He noticed when new plants were added. He noticed that it was clearly a carefully maintained garden. He noticed that someone cared about that small edge of space, even though it would never be seen by anyone who wasn't specifically looking. In May, he made his decision. He called Marcus. "I want to take the wall down," he said. Marcus came out and assessed it, and they talked about logistics. The wall couldn't simply be demolished. That was expensive and risky. But it could be partially dismantled. They could remove sections, create openings, turn the barrier into something more architectural than defensive. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. "Just tear it down." "I'm thinking I'll remove the middle section," David said. "Create a kind of archway, keep some structure, but make it possible to pass through if someone wanted to." "Your ex-wife might be interested to know you're physically manifesting metaphors," Marcus observed. But he was already calculating, already understanding what David wanted to do. When Karen saw the work begin, sections of the wall being carefully dismantled, an opening being created, she felt something she realized she'd been waiting for. Not absolution exactly, but movement, the possibility of movement. By mid-June, the wall still stood, but with an archway cut through the middle. You could stand on Karen's side and see through to David's pool. You could stand on David's side and see the garden. The neighborhood watched this deconstruction with interest. If the wall going up had been a scandal, the wall coming down was a redemption narrative. People started talking about it differently. "He realized his mistake," they said, missing the fact that both of them had made mistakes, and both of them had been trying in their separate ways to acknowledge them. Neither David nor Karen had talked to each other since the morning Karen had come to his door. But on the Saturday that the archway was completed, as David was standing in his yard assessing the new opening, Karen appeared on the other side. She walked through the archway. They stood facing each other across the pool. "Hi," Karen said. "Hi. I planted the garden for you," she said, "so you'd know that we understood." "The archway is for you," David replied, "so you'd know that I understood too." They stood in silence for a long moment, and then Riley and Aiden came through the archway, tentative, and walked to the edge of the pool. The water gleamed blue and inviting. David gestured toward it. "Go ahead," he said. The children looked at their mother. Karen nodded, barely perceptible, and they dove in. For the first time in almost 2 years, the sound of laughter came from David's pool. But this time it was invited. This time it was given freely. David and Karen stood at the pool's edge, and neither of them said anything, but something had shifted. Not forgiven exactly, but understood. The wall had been a language they both needed to speak before they could communicate anything else. "I thought about moving," Karen said finally. "I thought about selling," David admitted. "Why didn't you?" "Because I realized that sometimes the only way through a conflict is through it, and sometimes that means you have to build a wall first before you can figure out how to dismantle it." Karen smiled slightly. "That's either profound or completely bullshit." "Probably both," David said. They watched the kids swim, and the summer light moved across the water. And for the first time in a long time, David felt like he could breathe in his own backyard. The wall remained, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a barrier. It was a structure that had held their conflict until they were both strong enough to acknowledge it, and then it had become a frame through which they could see each other. By the end of summer, David had dismantled more of the wall. By autumn, only sections remained, sculptural pieces that marked where the barrier had been, reminders of what had happened when two people decided to turn a small violation into a permanent wound. And then, slowly, they became something else entirely. Something less like evidence and more like memory. Something less like punishment and more like warning. Something that said, we learned something here. The wall had been almost completely dismantled by the time winter arrived again. David had worked with Marcus to convert the remaining sections into a decorative installation, part art, part functional barrier that separated the two properties but no longer blocked movement. You could pass between the properties easily. You could see from one yard to the other. The pool area became something neither family had intended, a shared community space. The archway became a landmark. Neighborhood children learned they could ask permission to swim, and permission was granted. What had started as violation had eventually transformed into generosity, but a generosity that was chosen, that was bounded, that was fundamentally different from the trespass that had preceded it. Mike and David had become friends, bonded by the strange brotherhood of people who'd both learned hard lessons about boundaries at the same time. Corinne and David had become neighbors in the truest sense, people who lived adjacent to each other and had learned to respect the line between them, as well as the points of connection. The garden that Corinne had planted remained, now tended by all three adults. The flowers came back each spring, a small act of cultivation that nobody had suggested but everyone had contributed to. One evening in November, exactly a year after the wall had begun its deconstruction, David and Corinne stood together at the remains of the barrier, looking out at the pool. "Do you regret it?" Corinne asked, "building the wall?" David thought about it, genuinely considered the question. "No," he said finally, "because we wouldn't be here if we hadn't. We would have found some other way to hurt each other, some other way to violate each other's space. At least this way we built something visible. At least this way we couldn't ignore what was happening." That seems like a strange way to get to a good place. "Most good places start from bad ones," David said. "We just usually have the courtesy to pretend otherwise." Corinne looked back at her garden, at the blooms that had become perennials, that would return each spring without her asking them to. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know I said it before, but I've never really said it when I meant it completely." "I know you did," David replied, "and I know you do now." Behind them, through the archway that remained, Mike was helping Aiden and Riley with their swimming strokes. The sound of their laughter carried across the water. "That's what I wanted," Corinne said softly. "In the beginning, I just wanted my kids to have this, to have somewhere cool and happy to be. I just didn't know how to ask." "And now you do." "Now I do," Corinne agreed. The sun moved lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. The wall, what remained of it, caught the light and held it, a structure that had been transformed from a punishment into something more like a monument to the difficult process of learning to live next to other people. In the distance, the neighborhood was settling into evening. Someone was grilling. Someone was watering their lawn. The small rituals of suburban life continued, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded at 447 Maple Drive, at the property line where two people had finally learned the difference between defending yourself and destroying yourself in the process. The pool gleamed blue and beautiful, and it belonged to David Chen. And it was also, in some way that defied legal definition, also belonged to the family on the other side of the line. Shared space created not by violation but by choice. That, in the end, was the real twist. Not that the wall had come down, but that what had been built when it came down was worth far more than what had been destroyed.